Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Sherry Ben, Assistant Vice President for Institutional Inclusive Excellence for Student Initiatives here at Texas State University. On behalf of Institutional Inclusive Excellence, I want to welcome you to the first of our three-part town hall series, Storytelling, Healing, and Transformation. During this town hall series, we will explore various aspects of restorative justice and the ways in which restorative practices can help us to advance a more inclusive and racially just community. This town hall series is intended to provide us with an opportunity to engage interactively in the conversation about race and justice, which we reflected upon during our Juneteenth Day of Reflection and Solidarity. And while it is certainly important for us to reflect upon these issues, it is equally as important that community participation and community action be at the core of our efforts to advance racial justice. And all members of our community are needed and vital to the success of our work. At its core, restorative justice is about addressing the harms of injustice holistically, meaning relationally as well as structurally, with healthy social relationships and just social structures being our collective goals. As we begin this discussion, it is important that we acknowledge, honor, and respect the land upon which our institution and our communities were built. And we recognize those who came before us, who worked and died on the land where our communities exist. These ancestors should be remembered and honored. We recognize the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we gather within. We do this as a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. Land acknowledgements do not exist in past tense or in a historical context. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and thus we build our mindfulness and deepen our awareness as our present, within the present, and acknowledge our complicit participation. Acknowledging the land is indigenous protocol and a simple yet powerful way of showing respect. And it is a step toward correcting stories and practices that erase indigenous peoples' history and culture, and towards inviting and honoring truth. In recognizing that European colonizers stole from indigenous people through violence and genocide, this land occupied by Texas State University and San Marcos has specific significance. Archaeologists believe this area was inhabited by people who were the direct ancestors of roughly 80% of all living Native American populations in North and South America, and has been the site of continuous human inhabitation for over 11,000 years. Native communities across the Americas have demonstrated resilience and resistance in the face of violent efforts to separate them from their land, culture, and each other. They remain at the forefront of environmental justice movements to protect Mother Earth and the life she sustains for all of us. Further, enslaved people, primarily of African descent, provided exploited labor on which this country was built, with little to no recognition, and today we are indebted to their labor. We therefore wish to acknowledge this land on which Texas State University exists and operates. This land is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to be in a community in this physical, virtual, and metaphysical space to open our hearts to one another in the spirit of sharing our experiences in order to learn and be transformed by one another. Now, to get our town hall series underway, Dr. Denise Trout, president of Texas State University, will provide our opening remarks. Dr. Trout.
Thank you, Dr. Ben, and welcome to all of you. I am so glad you are joining us today for the first session in our three-part Restorative Justice virtual town hall series. This is important work we're doing together to strengthen inclusion at Texas State University and to stand against racism and enhance the quality of life for Black students, faculty, and staff. And even though we cannot gather in person, I know we will find a sense of community in this virtual setting. Our hearts are heavy today as we mourn the deaths of two civil rights heroes last week, Congressman John Lewis and the Reverend C.T. Vivian. We feel the loss deeply and reflect on their courage and integrity as we continue their fight for racial justice and equality. Texas State University has a special bond to the life and work of Congressman Lewis through our most famous distinguished alumnus, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. On March 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday, hundreds of peaceful protesters led by John Lewis were attacked and beaten by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Following that horrific day, President Johnson directed Congress to approve legislation removing barriers to Black people voting. The legislation became the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Johnson. Congressman Lewis was beaten so badly on Bloody Sunday that his skull was fractured, and he carried the visible scars of that fracture throughout his life. Although he called for nonviolent protest and activism and was dubbed an apostle of nonviolence. John Lewis often endured brutality and violence as he risked his life for civil rights. About 10 years ago, a white man who had assaulted Congressman Lewis at a bus station in Rock Hill, South Carolina in 1961, went to Washington to tearfully apologize to Mr. Lewis, who forgave him. After that white man's death, Congressman Lewis told the New York Times, "That's what the movement was always about, to have the capacity to forgive and move toward reconciliation." Moving toward reconciliation is rooted in listening to one another, in being heard, in looking squarely at our own bias and prejudice to truly learn from our collective history. To have the opportunity to learn about racism instead of experiencing it firsthand is a privilege. As a white woman, I have known that privilege. I will never personally know the experiences of Black people in our community and our nation. But I will do everything in my power as a leader of this university to support our Black students, faculty, and staff who bear the weight of systemic racism, who have experienced it personally, and who carry the trauma of more than 400 years of injustice and violence. Over the last several weeks, I listened and learned during our day of reflection and solidarity, and during listening sessions with Black students, faculty, and staff. They spoke of their pain, exhaustion, fear, and desire for change. The Black members of our university community have experienced barriers and disparities that have caused pain. Missteps cause suffering. As a university community and as president of Texas State University, we all together can and will do better. History has shown us that protecting voting rights protects civil rights. That's why, with a tumultuous election season fast approaching, we established an elections task force. Our goal is to prepare our university community and ensure we maximize opportunities for our students to engage in the voting process. In June, I asked members of my cabinet to collaborate with key university leaders to recommend strategies to support the safety, equity, and well-being of Black students at Texas State. Together, they created a 7-point plan, which includes these restorative justice forums. The forums, inspired by the feedback we received in our listening sessions, were created to nurture learning, nurture dialogue that will inspire the actions we must take to reimagine and repair our community. What does it mean to reimagine our community? It means examining the structure of our institution to build a community that is equitable and inclusive, and where everyone feels safe, regardless of their skin color. It's not only about creating a culture where people feel welcome. It's also about changing our culture so we are equally engaged in co-creating a community that meets the needs of all students, faculty, and staff. It means taking a hard look at our institution to find and remove barriers to inclusion and equity. It requires uncomfortable but productive conversation. I challenge you to think of these forums as classrooms where we share our stories, explore our personal and institutional prejudices, and expand our capacity to change, to heal, and to move forward in a new way. Achieving true inclusivity at Texas State is our collective responsibility. It's not the work of one team, or the work of one office, or the work of one division. We recently merged offices across our university that have done important work in diversity, equity, and inclusion separately for many years. This new organizational structure elevates our DE&I unit to an institutional level under the new name, Institutional Inclusive Excellence. And I am confident these changes set the stage for our dedicated DE&I leaders to achieve even more and magnify their impact. At its core, Texas State is a learning environment, creating global citizens to lead and thrive in a diverse world. This is how we best model anti-racist behavior, to change our community and equip our students to change our nation and our world. I want to thank Dr. Sherry Ben for her vision and commitment to bring this series to life. And I appreciate all the expert presenters and panelists who are offering their knowledge, their vulnerability, and their wisdom to our community and to this important cause. So thank all of you for participating today and for joining us to work for justice and define a path to real equity and inclusion at Texas State University. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trell, for those very honest, challenging, crucial, and encouraging insights. I think we've gotten our charge for today. So today's town hall will provide us with context for our successive conversations on race and justice. And we have developed this conversational process so that the majority of the time is reserved for discussion among panelists and you, the participants. Remember, as we embark upon this critical work of restorative justice through storytelling, healing, and transformation, your participation in today's town hall is essential and greatly appreciated. It is also necessary, a necessary component towards the healing and transformation of those in our community who have often felt marginalized and excluded. I encourage and invite you to join in during the open dialogue portion of our town hall, which Dr. Michael O'Malley, Dean of the College of Education, will facilitate and moderate. And so at this time, I turn over our town hall to Dean Michael O'Malley. Dr. O'Malley.
Thank you, Dr. Ben, very much. Good afternoon, everyone. We really want to thank you for participating today and for your commitment to be with us. We are all needed in this conversation, and we appreciate there are several hundred people from across the Texas State community who have registered for today. Again, we need each of you, and thank you for making the time to be with us on this late Friday afternoon in summer. We would like to begin recognizing with great respect and reverence that we are convoked as a university today by the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and many, many other Black lives that have been taken through contemporary lynchings. We are also convoked by the ongoing realities of anti-Blackness, racism, and interlocking oppressions that traumatize persons and communities of color in everyday life, in our larger societies, and also within our university community. And we are convoked by the urgent moral imperative in front of us today to interrogate intergenerational social structures and arrangements that result in racial discrimination and violence in policing, that caused race disparities in healthcare, education, housing, wealth, migration, and immigration. I'm grateful to be able to be with you all today, for us to be together, to have the opportunity through these town halls to learn with and from all of you, and for all of us to create real embodied hope by the actions that we can and will take together against racism and for restorative justice within and beyond our university community. As we move into the panelists, I'd like to give a brief overview again of our purpose, a little bit about how we'll handle questions today and comments, and then introduce our topic areas. Again, our core purpose with our town halls is the opportunity for us as a Texas State community to gain an understanding of the historical context of community resistance as a response to racial trauma, the current role and significance of restorative justice practices based on research, data, and testimonials, and to identify themes from discussion to convert into action items or projects. For our questions today, you'll notice on your screen the Q&A box, and we ask you to please use that at any time during the town hall and during the presentations. We invite questions. If you'd like to direct a question to a particular panelist, please let us know that in the comment box. But we also invite your thoughts, your ideas, your suggestions, your concerns, your experiences. So it's not only a Q&A today, but we also want to hear from you who are attending. It may be helpful if you're offering a thought or an experience more than a question to please let us know that at the beginning of your box. So if we could take a moment to think about and turn towards today's panelists. Our panelists will be sharing a perspective on a topic for about 5 minutes, and we have 5 panelists. Again, when they finish, we'll be moving out towards your questions, but also your thoughts and experiences and ideas. Our first topic area today is racial trauma as psychological construct, addressed by Kate Cottenham from the Counseling Center. After that, our next topic, a historical context of racial trauma in the United States, will be shared by Dr. Dwight Watson from the History Department. Resistance and rebellions as reasonable responses to generational trauma will be addressed by Dr. Russell Moses from the Philosophy Department. What is the social contract between a nation and its people will be taken up by Dr. Scott Bowman, School of Criminal Justice, and also Special Assistant to the Provost for Inclusion and Diversity. And what is the role of restorative justice in healing communities will be addressed by Veronica Silva, Restorative Justice Educator for Austin ISD, a Texas State alumna, and Woodrow Wilson Rockefeller Brothers Fund Fellow at Columbia University Teachers College. At this point, I'll invite each of the panelists to take a moment to introduce themselves, please.
Hi, my name is Kate Cottenham. I'm excited to be able to join you guys today. I'm one of the counselors in the Counseling Center here on campus. I'm a LPC, which is a licensed professional counselor, and I've been a therapist for about 10 years. One of the things that they asked me to come and kind of give a perspective about is the concept of racial trauma as a psychological construct. And just to kind of provide a definition, racial trauma is any experience of oppression or discrimination experienced by somebody as a result of their racial identity or someone's perception of their racial identity. This can happen, a lot of times we think of trauma as like a singular incident. That can be true, but often with racial trauma, it's more of a systemic experience happened either overtly or covertly throughout an individual's life. And it causes the same psychological experiences and symptoms as other forms of trauma. And it can be seen and having an impact on that individual. And it's important to note that oftentimes these traumatic experiences are the results of systemic structures that may be consistent throughout the individual's life and have like a cumulative effect in terms of distress and symptoms over that person's life.
And I think our panelists will continue to introduce.
Hello,
Yes, good.
I'm Dr. Dwight Watson, Professor Emeritus here at Texas State University. In my 20 plus years here at Texas State University, I was often called upon to speak about issues of race and issues of police brutality and others. Historians are the narrators of our silent truths. We research and we investigate and we tell the stories that would otherwise be unheard. Lynching, the tragedy of the 19th and early 20th century, is now being re-employed through police shootings and other acts of violence. But perhaps the most pernicious system of violence is the benign discrimination against African Americans as they work in businesses across the country and hit an invisible ceiling, and the rules of conduct and procedure do not fit them in their schemes to get promoted. Texas State University and its history department has a department full of social justice practitioners, but most importantly, we are full of truth sayers. And today, if I can do anything to you, is to say that racial trauma is a story that we still tell. Thank you.
Thank you, President Trouth, Vice President Ben, Dean O'Malley. Welcome, fellow panelists and participants. My name is Greg Moses. My pronouns are he, him, his. I teach philosophy at Texas State. Lately, I've been teaching courses in the philosophy of nonviolence, and we're sponsoring a series of visits by nonviolence trainers to work with interested students. I also edit a scholarly journal, The Acorn, a philosophical studies in pacifism and nonviolence. So I'm here today to talk about the resistance and rebellions as a rational response to generations of trauma, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Bowman. I am an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice and Criminology here at Texas State University. I also serve as a special assistant to the provost for inclusion and diversity. My participation today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate, is that as a faculty member in the School of Criminal Justice and Criminology, and understanding the recent events that have culminated with George Floyd, and certainly not dismissing of others that have befallen the same unfortunate circumstance, it's really caused me to rethink and reconceptualize policing, reconceptualize the role of criminal justice, and maybe some of the shortcomings and thinking about new ways to discuss that. And so today I'll be talking about the role and the importance of the social contract, using kind of fundamental social contract theory, and why I believe that's relevant to our understanding of police community relations. I look forward to the discussion as well.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Veronica Silva, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm Restorative Practices Associate in Austin Independent School District. This is my third year as a Restorative Practices Associate, and prior to my role, I taught for 6 years as a second, third, fourth, and 8th grade teacher. And in this current position, my role is to establish a collaborative working relationship with school administrators, faculty and staff, families, students, and community partners in order to implement a student-centered restorative practices environment through an anti-racist lens because we know race is the biggest factor in who succeeds in schools. And so I'm happy to be here and to share the work of restorative practices with everyone today.
So at this point, we'll return to Kate, I believe, and we'll move through thoughts from each of our panelists. Thank you.
I realized that I kind of launched into this earlier, but basically what I'm here to do is provide a psychological perspective on racial trauma and how it can impact not just individuals, but also communities and have a cumulative generational effect in the way it impacts how individuals see themselves, how individuals see their chances for success, very real barriers that Indigenous, Black, and people of color encounter as they move towards their goals, and also as they wrestle with what is psychological health, how do they conceptualize that, how do they access services such as mental health counseling, and kind of moving in that direction as they attempt to seek healing from very real systemic factors that have impacted them throughout their lives. And I acknowledge as a white woman today that I have definitely benefited from a system of white privilege, and working every day to do that work and try and be aware of my own privilege and how to learn and use that in a way that is healing and helpful and not in a way that victimizes others.
As a victim of racial trauma, don't know, is it working? Okay, thank you. As a victim of racial trauma, I have to today make a pledge to reduce its effect on how I understand, react, and perceive the world. And as I work with young men and young women across the country, and I talk about history and policing, I must be willing to tell them of past pains in order to achieve a brighter future. And so today I will be answering questions on the historical framework of racial trauma, the hierarchical society in which we live, and policing and violence. Thank you.
When he was 15 years old, Frederick Douglass, the greatest American to ever live, was assaulted by the legendary slave breaker Edward Covey, who intended to inflict a pretty thorough beating. But Frederick Douglass fought back. "From whence came the spirit, I don't know," Douglass wrote in his autobiography. "I resolved to fight, and I seized Covey hard by the throat." Covey asked Douglass if he meant to persist in his resistance, and Douglass told him that he did, because Covey had used him like a brute for 6 months, and he was determined to be used that way no longer. They fought for 2 hours. Finally, Covey let me go, puffing and blowing, saying that if I had not resisted, he would not have whipped me half so much. The truth was that he had not whipped me at all. And the rest of that year, the next 6 months that Douglass spent with Covey, the legendary slave breaker never laid the weight of his finger upon Douglass in anger again. "This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career," writes Douglass. "It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself. He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, And I now resolve that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. Frederick Douglass is our first witness today as we convene a town hall to address the role of resistance and rebellion as a rational response to the generational trauma perpetuated by white supremacy. In another autobiography, another great American, the late Congressman John Lewis, witness number 2, asks us to think about our greatest fear. Consider how you would feel if your life required you to face what you fear the most every day. Ultimately, if you survived the test, you would discover that what you feared actually had no power over you, no power to harm you at all. The freedom you would feel would be so beautiful, so uplifting, so invigorating. People ask me, how could you be arrested 40 times in the movement and never press charges, never fight or strike back? When people ask these questions, they perceive that I was being abused when in reality, I was being freed. By the time I stood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965, I had no fear of physical harm or death. So when people ask me how I managed my fear in that moment, I can truthfully say I was not afraid. I knew by that time that no one had the power to injure me. I had taken that power away by experiencing the worst they could do and discovering it did not diminish me. It did not harm me. It set me free and moved my soul beyond the fear of death. Our third and last witness today is Taekwon White, a 20-year-old musical theory major at Point Park University in Pittsburgh. When he joined recent protests in New York, here's what he told the French news service AFP, as reported in the Bangkok Post. It's gotten to a point where Black people are just asking not to be killed. It's just got to stop. We are angry. People are here dying and in poverty every day, and you want to kill us and just tell us to be quiet? No, we have to go out. We are treated like animals. This is how Black people have been treated for years and years. I understand why people would break the curfew and protest however they want to protest. We need to protest forever until this system is completely reversed and changed and built upon equality and freedom. I'm going to keep fighting as long as I have to. We have heard from 3 witnesses today, 1833, 1965, 2020. On the basis of their testimony, we return the question to our town hall: how are resistance and rebellion not rational responses to generational trauma perpetuated by white supremacy? Thank you.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, what I'm really looking at is this idea of a social contract. Depending on your discipline, and you may have referred to it as social contract theory. It's this idea that is as old as Socrates. And so in our earliest kind of philosophical constructions, this idea of how we get along with one another. As we move forward into the Age of Enlightenment, we have philosophers such as Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau that begin to have this conversation in more detail, really applying this idea of an exchange of social kind of personal rights in exchange for certain protections, whether the protections come from the government, some sovereign entity, or some other entity that is charged with overlooking the protections of the public itself. Sometimes it's an actual agreement, sometimes it's a hypothetical agreement. And one of the things that we do, kind of fast forwarding from the Age of Enlightenment to today, is that we take these social contracts sometimes for granted. We enter into them and out of them on a daily basis, sometimes a moment by moment basis, where we find ourselves doing things like agreeing to all stop at a red light and go at a green light. And we agree to do that, giving up the certain right of driving wherever we'd like in exchange for the protections of not being run over or not causing chaos like vehicular accidents. We, as faculty, exchange in the spirit of a social contract, provide each student with a syllabus. We provide the individual with a syllabus that says, here's what we're going to try to do over the course of the semester. Here's the dates, here's the exams, etc. That is an attempt at a social contract to allow students to know and understand what they're entering into before that. And we do this on a regular basis. Much like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and others, we operate from this perspective that there's a fundamental value in creating and establishing a social contract. Now, I say all that because one of the major issues that have been discussed over the past several months, kind of post George Floyd, and include in addition to defunding the police, abolishing the police, etc., is this question of police legitimacy. Right? It is the question of the legitimacy of police. Do they do what they do consistently? Do they do what they do fairly, etc.? Police legitimacy oftentimes gets conveyed with procedural justice, right? This idea that a police officer in an interaction will proceed fairly or consistently or reliably with every citizen that they come into contact with. And I think that for the most part, that's the underlying assumption, that's the underlying expectation, right? And so to take that one step further, the idea of a procedural justice experience from a police officer is really the discussion of a social contract, right? This idea that as a citizen of the United States, I am exchanging certain rights for the protections of the police, the protections and the assistance and potential co-facilitation with police departments and police officers. Okay? Herein lies the issue. There are certain individuals in this country that have always held a social contract with the police, and that social contract stays in effect pretty much regularly. Property owners have a strong social contract with the police. That's why we see, whether it's Minnesota or certainly other rebellions, we see one of the functions of the police is to protect property, right? Insured property, but for that matter. And it's not to say that it's inherently right or wrong, but it is something that the police have done pretty much the entire time. One of the things that we have seen and come to realize over the past few months very explicitly is that police have a social contract with the group that we have come to affectionately refer to as Karens. Right? There are individuals that say, I'm just simply going to call the police, and I know that when they get here, they're going to believe me instead of believing you. That is a basic social contract. Right? There's no question, we've seen it from barbecues to lemonade stands to Central Park bird watchers and everything in between. One thing that is consistent, though, is that for those group of individuals, they believe and experience and know that the social contract between their concerns or their needs or their exaggerations and the police work. That social contract works. Okay? On the other hand, the poor and the marginalized in this country have never known a social contract with the police. Right? Policing has changed and evolved and happened in many instances on the backs of the poor and marginalized in this country. Without a social contract with them, without addressing the needs, without a formal or informal exchange of needs for rights or rights for protections, right? The rights and protections are usually for the dominant group, whether it's by race, usually by class or socioeconomic status, those rights are protected. But usually that social contract comes at the expense of those that are poor, marginalized, of color, and we've seen this from the early indigenous populations to, unfortunately, current indigenous populations, as well as African Americans, immigrants, etc. Right? And so part of it has really, for me, has been really rethinking what that social contract needs to look like, right, for marginalized communities. What do the police need to do? What do they need to ensure in that exchange of rights for certain protections for communities of color, for marginalized communities, et cetera. And regardless of what we may think, there's ample research that suggests that even regardless of race, most folks have confidence in the police as a function. Really, what I would argue is that they're asking for and requesting and have been begging for a long time a social contract that looks the same as it does for everyone else. A contract that ensures their safety, their livelihood, their existence on this planet is protected in the same way that it is for everyone else. And I'm not sure that that social contract has ever been established. But I think that it's time for that discussion to really, really take place. Thank you.
All right, so to understand the work of restorative practices, it's important to have some foundational knowledge. Restorative practices are processes that proactively build healthy relationships and a sense of community to prevent and address harm. In a school setting, there's a spectrum in which restorative practices can be utilized in the classroom, curriculum, and culture of schools. The circle process, which most people are familiar with, is one component of restorative practices that was created by Indigenous people and has been used by them for thousands of years to promote harmony amongst their tribes and as a strategy to solve problems peacefully. The Indigenous community shared the circle process with non-Native people because they wanted different alternatives to mass incarceration for their community. So over time, it was adapted and popularized by the prison system and became known as restorative justice. Restorative justice is a part of restorative practices. And prior to repairing conflict or harm in schools, restorative practices focuses and values building relationships and community first in order to achieve justice when resolving conflict. Restorative practices is strengthened further when it's coupled with culturally responsiveness, which is a way of relating to, learning, responding to, and honoring the cultures of all students. Being culturally responsive requires you to be self-reflective, to understand who you are, what you bring to the culture and climate of the school, and how you will interact with your school community based on your values and beliefs. It's an outward manifestation of your inward truth. And knowing that we as individuals and systems are steeped in white, male, patriarchal, cis-hetero, ableist dominant culture within a colonized society, culturally responsive is framed through an anti-racist and intersectional lens. Research shows how these systems of oppression affect the academic success and discipline of students in K through 12. Academically, students of color, and in particular Black students, do not receive the same quality education as their white peers. And when it comes to discipline, Black students are more than 3 times as likely as their white peers to be expelled or suspended for the same behavior, which contributes to Black students being pushed out, more likely to drop out, and be introduced to the school to prison pipeline. Black Lives Matter, framing culturally responsive restorative practices through an anti-racist lens helps to ensure our work is not colorblind. And it honors the inherent dignity of everyone and moves us toward repaying the educational debt that is owed to Black, Indigenous, and all people of color. At institutions of higher education, research has already proven that historically underrepresented students experience racially biased microaggressions at all levels of engagement, recruitment, enrollment, retention, and graduation. Conducting restorative practices, which are evidence-based practices in K through 12, promotes the development of a stronger culture and climate that is welcoming, safe, and inclusive of all identities, effectively reduces suspensions, expulsions, and disciplinary referrals, and is actively undoing the hegemony of whiteness and racism, which further leads to academic success, retention, and graduation. And as someone who facilitates this work with middle school students, they will come to institutions of higher education as leaders of restorative practices, who will expect this kind of academic experience, campus climate, and ecology of support. What helps restorative practices gain momentum towards long-lasting change is when leaders, whether that's principals, directors, superintendents, or presidents, become active participants in this process with students, who will also uplift the work in their words and actions throughout the entire educational organization and use their institutional power to undo the oppressive systems and create true systemic change. Angela Davis said, "When children attend schools that place a greater value on discipline and security than knowledge and intellectual development, they are attending prep schools for prison." Restorative practices is the paradigm shift needed to decolonize our values and beliefs, to stop viewing students as prospective prisoners, and to start working with students and treating them as the inherent scholars they already are towards racial healing for everyone.
Thank you all, to all of our panelists. So I'll remind everyone in attendance, at this point, we're going to move into discussion, and we welcome, again, questions. Questions can be wide open. They don't need to be directed to a particular panelist, though if you'd like to direct one to a panelist, you can let us know that in the Q&A box. So you're using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen here, and that will get to us, and there are a couple of us that are sorting through questions to be able to bring forward a wide range. But you're also welcome to share thoughts or experiences, suggestions, ideas, things that you want to say in the conversation. So again, you could be asking a question, but you could have something you want to add that is important to you that's not a question. And so we look forward to those. For the panel, the first question we have in front of us today, for anyone who would like on the panel, who would like to be able to take this up. How and why has policing become so racially divisive, and what can police do to help?
Policing has always been racially divisive. Policing in American society began as a night watch system. That night watch system operated to protect goods and services of the wealthy or elite, and police that I've interviewed through time have all said that their function, as they understand it, is to ensure that the general welfare and property is taken care of. What happens in terms of race and police is this idea of bias. The majority of police officers do not come from the communities that they serve. And there is a breakdown in the link between them and their citizens. Consequently, they bring with them biases and unlived experiences to an urban environment usually. And as a result of that, they are taught in police academy for the most part, where crime areas are, there are the criminals. They're not, they don't look at this as that there are systemic issues that create this kind of hopelessness in the cities. They see people as the individuals that should be controlled rather than should be people that they can talk to. Policing works best when there is a system of interaction between the police and the citizens. Community policing is perhaps one of the better models. However, police tend not to like community policing because it requires the personal and it requires a re-examination of one's own life and one's own being within the context of people that he or she are uncomfortable with. African Americans know this too well, that they have been policed by policing rather than served and protected by policing. Thank you.
Okay. And then for our panelists, I'll just say, I'll just kind of watch for when, if a second or third panelist wants to address a question. So another question we have is why does it happen that it can be that so many white people will believe racism is real when we see the most heinous acts of racism being committed against Black persons, such as the murder of George Floyd and others? but don't believe people of color when they try to share with them the truth of racism that they deal with in their everyday lives, at work, at school, driving, when visiting a doctor, shopping, etc.
I can speak to this, or Russell, if you want to go first, you can. I think a lot of times it comes from a psychological place of this narrative that we've been presented with, that racist events are often caused by the racist, who's like the person we see in a movie, who's always almost a cartoonish representation of somebody who's so racist. I immediately think of like Bryce Dallas Howard's character in The Help, where she is clearly the villain. You are against her from the get, but there are these good white people who are not racist, and they're all fighting against this like cartoony racist person. That creates like a psychological comfort where you can walk away from that movie being like, I'm a good person. I'm not one of the bad people. And because you're able to do that on a day-to-day basis, you're able to kind of hold on to what we call like the just world fallacy, where we assume that every single day the world's going to be a good place if we're in this privileged space and we're not one of the bad people. And so a lot of times for white people who may either be actively engaged in racial discrimination or microaggressions especially, get super defensive because it's not just questioning this one action, it's questioning a whole model of how their life has been established and up to this point. And so in order to acknowledge that something racially unjust just happened, they have to acknowledge that the world itself is not just. And that often like bursts the bubble of privilege, because then you kind of like the dominoes start falling of like, oh my gosh, there is a system of oppression. I have benefited from the system of oppression. I would not be in the position that I am now if this system did not exist and allow me to have rights and privileges and spaces that have been actively stolen or denied to others.
Thank you, Kate, for that psychological account. In philosophy, we talk about epistemology, theories of knowledge, and we talk about epistemologies of ignorance. And so we could talk about white epistemology, white-centered epistemology as an epistemology of ignorance about the experiences of people of color. Because for the most part, white folks have to go outside of their center of lived experience in order to understand what's going on, or as the questioner asked, they have to be prepared to understand that they don't know what's happening when people of color speak to them, and take people of color seriously as bearers of knowledge that white people don't have. So overcoming the epistemology of ignorance is also a challenge that white populations face.
So a question directed to any of the panelists. There is a unique connection between colorblindness and abstract liberalism as we speak of social contracts and social justice. However, restorative practices within higher education assume students and faculty are on equal platforms in terms of race, gender, language, and power. Will there be curriculum changes that challenge the white hierarchy within higher education institutions to help promote racial and ethnic diversity in education?
I'll go ahead and start. First, I want to, whoever the question came from, I appreciate the Bonilla Silva reference. To answer the question more specifically, yes, and just not only, first I'm going to answer with regards to Texas State. Texas State University has a multicultural curriculum institute where faculty are invited to attend annually. And the specific purpose is to transform an existing course or an existing and subsequent courses to be more inclusive, to have inclusive authors, perspectives, narratives, etc. And so there are specific things in place at Texas State University to be able to address that issue. Beyond that, though, I can tell you that departments and chairs and deans are having this discussion or these types of discussions regularly, and faculty are recognizing, some faster than others, but are recognizing the importance of speaking to a broader audience, to speaking to a more inclusive audience in what they present and how they present it, asking questions like who's missing from this lecture, who's missing from this topic or dialogue. Those things are happening. Unfortunately, it's not something that you're going to leave for the fall and come back in the spring and everyone's going to be doing it. It is a process, and it's a challenge for some faculty more than others, depending on your background, your discipline, your the type of courses you teach. But I can tell you that it has been discussed on a variety of levels, and is seen as essential, not just in moving forward as a Hispanic serving institution, but moving forward as a university that is preparing students for a global experience, a diverse global experience.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too. So I think in the question it was said that restorative justice assumes that everyone's on a level playing field. And so that's where that's why we frame it as restorative practices in our district, because it's working to help adults understand the power that they're wielding in the classroom, and that it's really not restorative, it's not restorative justice, and it's not restorative practices if we are not willing as the adults in the room to share that power with students, and to, it has to be with students, and we have to be able to meet them where they're at and let go of that power and honor them as scholars. And that's why educators have difficulty at times with students, and situations can be escalated to where administrators get involved, to where situations that was just a simple classroom misunderstanding could have been solved in the classroom, and then students are being pushed out into ISS, and then they're missing school on top of that. And so, and I think the question was also about the curriculum. Can you say a little bit more, Dr. Melly, the part they said about curriculum, about changing it? Oh, sorry. Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. I just think the questions are a little bit more about what the possibilities are for curriculum change here inside the university. And I'll add in a follow-up question that came in from someone else that's related also about how can professors here at the university, how can professors take up culturally responsive practices and culturally responsive teaching inside their own curriculum, their own practices as an instructor?
Sure. I would say, I'm thinking back to some of the experience that I had as a brown woman in my undergrad and graduate school experiences, and how at times, some of the classes that I entered where we'd have conversations, or the lesson was about racism, on highlighting the disparities in data based on race. And what would happen after that is a feeling of tension, of hearing remarks made by white students who were angry and upset about it, who were in disbelief about it. And for me as a brown woman, that further exasperated the microaggressions that I received. And then when it came to my grad experience, having that same classes were incorporating anti-racism work in the curriculum, but not having the opportunity to discuss and unpack that left a lot of weight for me to have to go to other classes with these students, to live in the dorms with these students, to do projects with these students, and to be dismissed with whatever I brought to the table because their whiteness was enraged and their white fragility was showing, quite frankly. And so for me, I would have appreciated if there would have been some, what Dr. Bowman was saying, some university-wide social contract. What is our contract when it comes to having difficult discussions and conversations about race that could be incorporated into the university seminar? And then whenever a professor is going to touch on racism and something difficult, they outlined that with the social contract. Let's remember, to whatever they are. For our work, we use a lot of the courageous conversations protocol, which is to stay engaged, speak your truth, experience discomfort, and expect and accept non-closure. So that way people have an understanding of what they're stepping into. And then on the end, having a discussion about it would be helpful to understand each other and where everyone's at and moving towards anti-racism. So.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Mike,
Yes.
having been here quite a while, can you hear me? Okay, having been here quite a while, the one thing I learned when I first got here was that there had to be a sincere desire on the part of those who participate in the instructional and student relationship to take the information that was coming to you and to understand it within its proper context. I, as a professor, found colleagues at times who told students not to take my class when I first got here. And for a long time, being almost the only person on campus teaching race, the history of race, and having a very difficult time at times, and particularly when it came down to the end of the semester and student evaluation, having students write to the governor on me because I talked about Roosevelt and race. And those are the kinds of things that start to happen for you as a minority faculty person. But I understand the difficulty for people who have inherent biases trying to confront race or difficult discussions because they haven't confronted their own biases. And so one of the things we're gonna have to start doing as faculty, not just faculty of color, is unpacking our biases as we move into this thing and do the hard work that it takes to transform Texas State University. You are on the cusp of becoming something special, but you can't get there until you do the hard work. And the way you improve curriculum is have hard conversations about the information.
Thank you. Another question we have that I think connects to that. What characteristics would faculty and staff recognize in others who might be experiencing racial trauma? More to the point, how can we as individuals and as a community support others who are experiencing racial trauma?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think one thing that is really important is even like in the way sometimes we think about racial trauma as if it's somehow distinctly different than other forms of trauma. And it is, and that it's like systemic and cumulative, but it also has the same symptoms as so many forms of trauma. Very similarly to the way a child who grows up in a house with an abusive parent learns to be constantly vigilant, internalizes messages that are taught by that abusive parent into their self-concept so that they don't have to worry about offending that parent. It starts to wear on the internal workings of that person. And a lot of times when you're living in, we can kind of think of like the systemic racism in our country as that abusive parent. And when you're the person who's being abused by that system, you start internalizing values that that system tell you are important, things that like are at like war with who you are internally. And that causes ongoing stress. It can lead to depression, anxiety, feelings of alienation, issues with self-esteem, self-concept, even like difficulties with self-compassion. It can lead to like healing being a challenging thing that happens more in community because it's the problem started in community. And so I think looking for those same things that you would look for in somebody who was experiencing any kind of trauma or duress, and then the healing part of it a lot of times happens when we have those hard conversations, very much like what Dr. Wasson was saying, that work has to happen internally for people who hold those privileges, and then also create that space where you can approach those conversations in a non-defensive, healing, reconciling kind of way, and not in the situation where you put the burden right back on the person who's been traumatized. That doesn't lead to healing.
I'll add that too. The question just reminded me of what Dr. Watson said earlier about being vulnerable with students and sharing about his past pains and how, at least from my understanding, you're saying, working through that and sharing them. And that's absolutely what a culturally responsive teacher does. And someone who's restorative practices is, I didn't have the language and understanding of racism and how it was covert and very overt and all the nuances that come with it until I was in undergrad. And so as a teacher, it's my duty to share with students that education, that knowledge, and that power, and to be vulnerable with them too in a K through 12 setting to begin to help them unpack the experiences that they are dealing with. As I moved from an elementary teacher to a middle school teacher, what I noticed was in a predominantly Latinx population of students, the students were coming to my classroom so much more hardened by being in a racist system and feeling like they were coming into another classroom of a teacher who wasn't going to see much in them and was just going to treat them poorly because of the systemic racism that they had been experiencing in their schooling lives. And so, so the work of me being vulnerable helped and opened that door. And I'd like to share with my students how I used writing as a tool to undo and unpack that racial trauma. And it led to a lot of kids doing a lot of writing. And I can remember the day after Trump was elected, that was the most difficult day as an 8th grade teacher to step into that classroom and to face them. And so I couldn't do anything that was on my curriculum. And we just took the day to write, to have discussion, to challenge each other, and to have disagreements with each other. And because as a culturally responsive teacher, I set those parameters in place, 8th grade students are having these conversations on racism and able to come back day in and day out with each other and still continue in building that relationship and community with each other. So if it can be done in K through 12, it can be done in higher education as well.
Thank you, Veronica.
Hey,
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, just one other small piece, because I think the part that was asked in the question that maybe didn't get addressed in full is the question of kind of what can I do? And I think that there are authors, Wildman and Davis, and they wrote on privilege. And one of the things that they wrote about privilege was that is the importance of recognizing the privilege that a person holds, whether or not to enter into other forms of oppression, right? And so the advice I would give in terms of, how do I lean in, how do I be better, is to recognize that privilege and to recognize the value in relinquishing that privilege in order to be an ally or to be in support of whatever that other group or marginalized group or group in need may be. And so it's to say, I'm not a first generation student, but I understand, and it's important for me, even going back to what Dr. Watson said earlier, to do the work necessary to understand the experience of a first gen student or a DACA student or an openly LGBTQIA student or a disabled student, veterans, etc. And so it's taking the time and doing the work and saying, and it's not simply saying, that's not my problem, they're not my problem, they're not me. If it's one state and one university, then it's really kind of setting that privilege to the side, leaning in and saying, how can I be an ally to these groups, particularly at times when it's most needed.
Dr. Watson, I think you're still muted.
Oh, sorry. Mike, I did something this year and last year and this year that has really kind of impacted my students. I give them recipes. I can cook pretty good. So I give them recipes, one a week. And I found since doing this, that students send me pictures of the food they cook. And they say to me, Dr. Watson, I say, yeah, this is what my grandmother cooked. And the relationship begins by something as simple as that, but the power of food is a segue to establishing a bit of an understanding about something people simply don't understand. A guy told me he was Italian and he said he couldn't cook. I told him how to make spaghetti. And he was like, that's the way my mother makes it. And for the rest of the semester, you know, that was not a day this kid was not there looking for something else to come. And so sometimes we have to give something to get something back, but you got to give it from that place inside of you. You know, it's not just the books we read. It is the heart we show on our sleeves to one another. We have to become living models of what we are talking about now. Thank you.
Another question for any or all of the panelists. What can Texas State University professors, staff, administrators, and leaders commit to and do so that inherent race and racist views and prejudices that lie dormant in the institution can be actively uncovered and excoriated by both the Texas State University and the San Marcos community?
Well, since I'm not working, hell, I can say anything. Wake up! Listen, talk to people who will tell you the truth you don't want to hear sometimes. We tend to, in leadership, particularly administration, hire similar beings to do similar things for us. But sometimes you got to find that person who can give you the keys to what you're looking for, even though y'all may ideologically disagree. And what we have to do in higher education is what we're trying to tell the young people to do. And that is reach across the aisle to people who have different perspectives, different ideals, different beliefs. And they have a way of getting things done that may not be the way you would do it, but it reaches a considerable number of students. And when you reach across the aisle for no gain for yourself, it means a lot to people. Because one, they see your sincerity, and there's hope in sincerity. And I don't want to sound too overly sentimental, but I'm starting to believe that the transformative power of love for the process and the students will be the thing that will lift up the university and take it to the next level.
Okay. In the next question, we're going to link two separate questions related to policing. The first one is more large scale, with the idea of, do you think because the police force is founded in racism, can the same force make changes to protect all citizens peacefully and equally across difference and diversity and race, now that we're having this conversation? Or does that whole system need to be uprooted and changed? And then the second link question brings it closer to campus. What are your thoughts on can or how can UPD create a safe environment for all students across race and all backgrounds in the current moment, considering the health and economic crisis that we're in, considering racist policing and other practices of racism in the society, and also considering the heated election season that we're in? So I invite you to take up any piece of that.
I would just like to begin by saying, from the point of view of resistance and rebellion, that there have been some pretty harsh treatments of Texas State students recently by the university police. And I hope that in the spirit of today's conversation about restorative justice, about circles of talk, that we can transform our relationship to student protesters through these kinds of theories and practices. And I think that would go a long way to addressing one of the issues that we've experienced on campus. And I hope on that basis that we can revisit some of the punishments that have been visited over the last couple of years to students of conscience who were quite sincere in their protest about conditions that now we're sitting around talking about, you know, in a very nice fashion.
I think one thing before answering that question that's important to restate is what Dr. Watson said at the very beginning, and that is that the history of the relationship really, I mean, he focused on African Americans, but the relationship between indigenous populations, African American populations, marginalized groups, immigrants, etc., and the police has essentially been the same, right? Over time. It's different titles, more professionalism, more bureaucracy, but same intent, similar intent. And the irony of it for policing is that police officers, police units, police departments, police chiefs have done tremendous work in improving the efficiency, the functionality of policing as an institution. They do more with less. They use technologies in ways that they have not in the past, or have been limited in the past. They, you know, problem-oriented policing, predictive policing. There are all sorts of things that have happened over the past 100 years that have improved the fundamental function of policing. The one thing that policing has not done over the past 150 years or 200 years is address its race and ethnicity problem. It has brushed it under the, you know, between police unions and police departments and honestly, grand juries and prosecutors, the just desserts that are sometimes associated with actions have never been fulfilled. The macro level trauma, the macro level interactions, the history of things like COINTELPRO at the federal level. You know, there are things that police departments have done historically or police functions have done historically that have never been addressed, are oftentimes swept under the rug, are dismissed. And as the result of that, that's where police departments find themselves right now, being forced to address issues that have been 100, 150, 200 years in the making, that some probably never thought they would have to address or never realized the importance of addressing them. And so for whether it's the UPD, Austin, San Antonio, San Marcos, Chicago, wherever, part of it has to be this recognition of the function of policing. Part of it is the responsibility of the governments, the mayors, the city councils, et cetera, that charge police departments with doing certain things or offering privileges to other parts of the community when they don't do certain things. All of those things need to happen in order for police departments to realize, and I'm going to go back to what I used in my own intro, to realize this legitimate, consistent social contract between all citizens equally, the true procedural justice, and the police that are designed to serve and protect those communities. And until that reckoning takes place, unfortunately, we will bump into this issue again and again and again. And we've seen over the past couple of months where certain cities, like Phoenix, for example, and others, where they're still bumping their heads in the same issues, killing Black and Latino folks in their driveways, walking down the street, asleep in their cars, etc. Those things need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed. And it needs, in the spirit of restorative justice, it needs to happen with the victims, the communities that have been victimized for multiple generations, to be empowered to come to the table and share in that discussion. Because if they don't, you're going to get the same rebellions that we've had for as long as there have been police-based rebellions in this country.
I feel like I just kind of following on what you said, Dr. Bowman, I think as a member of the queer community, I'd be remiss if I didn't take a second just to acknowledge that these experiences are even exponentially felt by Black members of the queer community and POC members of the queer community and their interactions with the police, with policing of gender, policing of sexuality. And so I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that kind of intersectional piece of this conversation as well.
Absolutely.
One of the things having worked in law enforcement and been in criminal justice a long time, policing has its own hierarchy, but they see themselves in a relationship with the political business elite. And they find themselves oftentimes doing the bidding of that group in their own minds. But that group will turn on them as soon as the police become a liability. And what I am starting to sense is there's going to be a call for reform that's from the top down. And that's unfortunate because those kinds of reforms are not structural. They are usually in function only. We'll change what we do rather than change who we are. And again, we have to get back, particularly campus police, we have to get back to the point where the police didn't mind walking and talking with students. Because when you do that, you do establish relationships. And, you know, I'm a pretty tough guy, but there's nothing more beautiful than seeing one of these kids walk across the stage from a first generation family or any family on graduation day and wave at everybody and shake the cop's hand at the end of the stage because they had a good relationship with him. Somehow the university community has to try to create an esprit de corps to bring back civility and to encourage people to take a deeper look at themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. As we approach 5 o'clock, we'll begin to wrap up this first town hall. Many thanks to all of our panelists for their thoughts and all of our people in attendance for your questions and thoughts. Looking at the number of questions that have come in, there's a lot we have not been able to get to, and appreciate very much that we're starting that conversation in the sense that there's a lot more to be said right here today, and those are very valuable contributions. Some just to tap some of the questions that we're not going to take up as we approach the end, but to hear the wide range. Quite a number of faculty are wanting to be able to learn more about how to take up and engage restorative practices in a classroom. There is a student asking, what do I do, what do any of us do when we experience racism and racist people in our own families, and how do we advocate and change that? There are someone sharing a fact that relates to disparities that Veronica pointed out in discipline in K-12 schools, expanding that to point out that Black and Latinx people make up over 60% of US prisoners while making up 35% of the adult population. And so seeing that pipeline also continuing out of schools. And there are continued questions around the policing and around protest. And so the focus on perhaps force and violence used to stop protests, and the fear that this will increase violence and oppression towards Black Americans and persons of color, particularly as they are involved in advocacy and protest. So just some of the other concepts and many more that people are asking. I'm going to pass it back to Sherry Ben, Dr. Sherry Ben, who will point us forward to our next town halls and to continuing this process. Thank you all very, very much.
All right, thank you so much to our panelists and to our moderator. This was a really outstanding and robust conversation, and we're so excited that those of you who joined us were able to do so. And we're so sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but you can bring those questions back to us during part 2 of the town hall. So we hope that you come back for that. So just a few things as far as a number of takeaways for us to consider with regard to today's town hall. So from our conversation today, we better recognize that not only not only is a fundamental element of restorative justice the idea that we are all connected one to another, and therefore when any members within our community have been injured, feel excluded, or traumatized, it is necessary for us to engage the process of healing and transformation in a manner, consistent with the restorative justice principle that Veronica helped us to understand, that we do the work of justice with the people and not to or for the people. It is important that our process is as inclusive and participatory as possible, and it must be centered on those impacted. It's the only way that we can build relational capacity and create a healing and transformative process together as a community. We must also take responsibility and acknowledge trauma that has transpired transgenerationally. We must also explore our institutional contract with one another, and we must learn to become comfortable with discomfort if we're going to engage this work. The work of racial justice and inclusive and restorative practices is hard work. In order for all members of our community to feel as though they matter, are valued, and belong, our panelists remind us and help us to further know that we have to roll up our sleeves and do this tough and exciting work together as a community, working holistically, simultaneously on interpersonal, intergroup, and systems levels. Vulnerability, accountability, and truth are all necessary. And I'll close with a quote from Maya Angelou. She says, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." Thank you so much for attending today's town hall panel, the first in our series on restorative justice, storytelling, healing, and transformation. Please join us again for our next town hall, which will be coming up in August, on August the 3rd, and it will be at the same time. This next town hall will be focused on storytelling, and it will include students, faculty, and staff, and another outstanding moderator. So thank you again on behalf of Institutional Inclusive Excellence. We appreciate your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again virtually. Thank you, and have a great weekend.